Hey, NL110, this is Ensign Alex Wong with Captain Mulaney, and we're here to talk about recognition prime decision. Seems intuitively, obviously, that one thing that leaders do is make decisions. Scientifically, what do we know about decision making, Captain?
So we've studied decision for a long time. It's interesting that for a long time, the way that we studied decision was to kind of construct what the optimal decision-making processes would be. And so a lot of the early decision-making studies and so forth looked at logic and statistics. And we read Kahneman talking about system one and system two. So Kahneman was actually a decision researcher. And him and his colleagues, what they were interested in is figuring out why people made decisions that were irrational if you looked at the statistics and logic and so forth. And their whole conversation about system one and system two is part of the answer to that question. Why do people make quote unquote bad or statistically not supported decisions? And the short answer to that is that generally we use our system one. And so we're drawing on our perceptual processes, we're making guesses about the way the world is, and we're using that information to inform our judgments and our decisions.
So what do you think the best model of decision making is?
Yeah, it's hard to say what the best model is. I would say perhaps the one that I've found to be most useful is what we're talking about today, the recognition prime decision model. This was developed by a researcher named Gary Klein and his colleagues. And somewhat like Kahneman, they went out to study the way that people make decisions. And it's interesting, before they went into the field, they kind of had a guess about how people would make decisions. So they kind of assumed that people would make decisions the same way that you may have selected a college, right? You pick a lot of options, you list all the features of all of the options, you weight all of those features, then you essentially calculate a number, and that becomes your decision. So Klein and his colleagues, they studied decision makers actually in the situations in which they were making decisions. They went on Navy ships, among other things. They studied firefighters. So the firefighter chiefs, for instance, as they were making decisions, they would show up at a fire and they would start telling people what to do. And there's a lot of different things that you could do, but they were telling people very specific things to do. So they were making a decision. But when Klein and his colleagues went and said, so how did you make that decision? Many of them didn't even feel like they had made a decision. They just said, well, this was the natural thing to do. And so what Klein and his colleagues did is they captured what was actually going on inside of their heads as they were recognizing what the right thing to do is. And so what they realized is that people look at a situation and there's goals that they're trying to achieve in that situation, like put out a fire. They look for different cues, and the more expert you are, the more you know which cues to pay attention to. So a fire chief would look at the way the fire is burning, look at the whether or not there's fire hydrants, et cetera, and get some idea of how much water they have. And they would kind of recognize patterns. So based on how the smoke was moving in and out of the windows, et cetera, it would give them an idea of how the fire was burning inside of the house. And based on how the fire was burning and the water that they had available, to them as experts, it seemed obvious, like this was the right thing to do. So their mind selected an action script. One of the interesting things that they found is that after they selected an action script, usually what they would do is they would think about doing the action that they thought of. And in their minds, they would see themselves doing it, giving that order, fighting the fire in a certain way. And they would think to themselves, does it work or does it not work? And if it didn't work, then they would adjust it a little bit and think up a new action script. But this was an important part of the decision making because in essence, they were kind of just intuitively coming up with something to do. And then if they had time, they would use their conscious mind to think about whether or not that was a good decision. And one of the most important conclusions by Klein and his colleagues was that people didn't generally come up with a lot of different options and select out of those options. Usually they would come up with one option, and if it was good enough, they would do it. And if it wasn't good enough, they would change it. And then if that one was good enough, then they would do it. So it's something that they call satisficing, which is coming up with an answer that is good enough to get done what you need to get done. And once you come up with an answer that's good enough, typically your mind is ready to stop thinking about it.
How does the decision-making process look like in a model form?
Yeah, so we'll pull up a picture of that for you real fast. Really, what they did is they took the process that I just described and just captured it in a diagram. But what you see on top is we find ourselves in situations, and for the situations that we find ourselves in, we typically have a goal state. There's something that we're trying to accomplish, and based on the thing that we're trying to accomplish, that drives what we pay attention to in our environment. So that drives which cues we pay attention to. And when we see a bunch of cues, typically that can assemble itself into a pattern. Um, for instance, if you're in traffic and you see another lane opening up, right, then you can see the cues for the new lane, and that's a pattern in your mind that, okay, there's a lane that I can go in that might be a little bit faster than the lane that I'm in right now, and then that generates an action script. So what am I going to do based on the pattern that I recognize? And here's the interesting thing we were just talking about with the firefighters is once people come up with an action script, then typically they think about themselves doing that in their mind. They kind of run it through, and when they run it through in their mind, then they kind of get automatic feedback on what their mind thinks will happen if they do it. So it's a way for us to actually kind of think into the future just a little bit to examine our decision making.
And this cycle, it all happens in a split second. Am I correct?
Yeah, it happens very, very fast. So arguably, your mind is going through this cycle every second, every couple seconds, or if you break down all the things that you do, in essence, this is you're going through a cycle every single thing that you do. So think about how many times you just move around and do things like scratch your face or move your body to be more comfortable, right? In each one of those situations, the goal state is my face itches, right? The cue is I can feel where it itches on my face. I have a pattern of usually when it itches, I can scratch it, so that generates that action script. And oftentimes, with a lot of things we do, we don't even think about ourselves scratching it. We just go ahead and enact that action script. Um, so another example, let's think about something simple, like let's say you're hungry. You're in the kitchen and you're hungry. So being hungry, recognizing that you're hungry, becomes your goal state. Once that you have that goal state of feeding yourself, right, then you're going to pay attention to the cues in the environment that are relevant to feeding yourself. Right, so you're not paying attention to the pictures on the refrigerator, perhaps, but you're more interested in what's inside. So you're going to look for food, and let's say you see bread and you see peanut butter and you see jelly. Those are all different cues. Those are foods that are available to you. There might be other foods as well, like pomegranates and chia seeds. Who knows? Um, so when you see the peanut butter and the jelly and the bread, now suddenly there's a pattern that emerges in your mind because you think of the peanut butter and jelly sandwich, right? Which is a combination of all of those cues, and so that generates an action script. You know how to make and eat a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and so that action script pops in your mind. But let's say now we're going to think about doing that action script. What if I just committed myself to a low carb diet? Right. So now when I envision myself eating that peanut butter and jelly sandwich, I think about, oh, wait a second, that's carbs. I don't want to eat the bread. And so your mind might reject that action script and essentially go back to the drawing board and try to think of something else to eat.
Yeah, so how does this relate to the two systems, system one and system two that Kahneman describes?
Yeah, great question. The system one and system two are both represented in the model. And I think the best way to think about it is if you look at the outer circle, in essence, the outer circle is your system one process, and the inner circle is your system two process. So as Kahneman talks about, our system one is very associative, right? And so we're going to see cues, see patterns, and action scripts are just going to pop into our mind. And in many cases, we just do those action scripts without thinking about it. What's really nice about the recognition prime decision is it actually shows the interface between system one and system two. So system one more or less generates all of your ideas, and system two looks at those ideas and decides either yes, I want to do that, or no, I don't. I've heard we talk about having free will. I've heard some people argue that we don't actually have free will, we have free won't. Because if you decide to do what System 1 wanted to do anyway, then more or less System 1 made the decision. So the way that System 2 actually empowers itself and has an impact on our decisions is when it rejects the things that System 1 wants to do and says, no, that's not good enough. Go back to the drawing board. And another really interesting thing about that relationship is notice too that in a lot of ways, System 2 can't generate its own answers. It can just say, you know, what you generated isn't good enough, try again. So really almost all of our creative thinking and our ideas generally emerge out of System 1. And then System 2 kind of can sit in the background and make decisions about what System 1 produces.
Is this model useful beyond just understanding how people make decisions?
Right, yeah. So, you know, this is labeled as a decision-making model. And so we might think, okay, this is just about decisions. And if you're into the Navy military stuff, people talk about the OODA loop. This is actually quite close to the OODA loop. So it is actually really good for describing decisions. But if you think about what the brain does for animals, like why do animals have brains and plants don't? Animals have a requirement, more or less, because they have the ability to move around all of the time. And so the problem that the mind has to constantly solve for an animal is, what should I do next? Where should I move next? And so in essence, this decision-making process describes the process that the mind is constantly going through to make the decision, what do I do next? So it's labeled as a decision model, but I would argue that it's a pretty good model for almost all human thought. We can elaborate to the point where we're thinking completely abstractly, right? And almost all System 2. And perhaps that might escape from this model just a little bit because we're not actually trying to solve problems. We're just thinking about things, perhaps. But for the most part, I think that humans are constantly deciding, even though we don't think about decisions, just like the fire chiefs didn't think that they were making decisions. We don't feel like we're making decisions all the time, but in fact, internal to our minds, we're doing that constantly. The fact that I'm shaking my head to emphasize my point, some part of my mind had to decide that that was a good idea. I see you shaking your head, yes. There's some part of your mind that is making the decision to shake your head, yes. If your mind wasn't deciding that, then your body wouldn't do it, right? And so I think that this recognition prime decision model actually describes each of those micro decisions that we make, and also many of our macro decisions.
Well, thank you, sir, for your time, and join us on our next episode.
Thank you, Alex.